The year is 1816. On the open plains of southern Africa, beneath a sky stretched wide and endless, a young warrior stands over the bodies of his enemies. His spear gleams in the afternoon sun. Not the long-throwing spear of tradition, but something new, something shorter, deadlier. His face is calm, unshaken, as though he has not just fought a battle, but conducted an experiment. Around him the grass is stained red. The old way of war is dying here, on this field. And in its place, a new doctrine is being born, one that will reshape an entire continent. This is not a tale of kings born into power. This is the story of a man who was cast out, humiliated, and left to die in exile. A man who returned with a vision so radical, so unforgiving, that it would transform scattered clans into a military empire capable of facing down colonial powers. Who was this man who rose from exile to forge an empire with nothing but discipline, strategy, and the blade of a spear? This is the story of Shaka Zulu, the Napoleon of Africa. Around the year 1787, in the rolling hills of what is now KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, a child was born into scandal. His name was Shaka, son of Senzangakona Kajama, chief of the small Zulu clan, and Nandi, a woman from the neighboring Langani people. But this was not a celebrated birth. It was a mistake, a stain. Nandi had not been Senzangakona's wife. She had been pregnant before any formal marriage could take place. In the rigid social structures of the time, this was unforgivable. When the elders of the Zulu clan learned of the pregnancy, they dismissed it as nothing more than an intestinal condition. A beetle, they said, called Ishaka. The name stuck, and so did the shame. When Shaka was born, his mother was sent away. She returned to her own people, the Langini, carrying the infant who had already become a symbol of disgrace. Senzangakona would go on to marry properly, father legitimate sons, and build his lineage. Shaka, meanwhile, grew up in exile. A boy without a father, without a home, without a name worth speaking. Life among the Langani was not kind to Nandi or her son. They were outsiders, dependents, tolerated but never embraced. Shaka was mocked relentlessly. The other boys called him a bastard. They taunted him for his illegitimacy, for his mother's shame, for his very existence. In the oral histories passed down through generations, it is said that Shaka was small for his age, thin, and awkward. He was an easy target. But humiliation has a way of sharpening certain souls. Where other children might have broken, Shaka hardened. He learned to endure pain. He learned to mask his emotions. And perhaps, most importantly, he learned to watch. He observed the warriors who trained in the clearing. He studied the way they moved, the way they fought, the way they spoke of battle as though it were an art form. He saw the rituals, the posturing, the inefficiency. And even as a child, he began to ask himself, why? Why did warriors throw their spears from a distance and then retreat? Why did battles drag on for hours with so few casualties? Why was war treated as a game of honor rather than a science of survival? These were dangerous questions for a boy with no status to ask. But Shaka was not interested in status. He was interested in power. And power, he was beginning to understand, came not from birthright, but from mastery. When Shaka was in his early teens, his mother was cast out once again, this time by the Langani themselves. They had grown tired of supporting her. Nandi and Shaka wandered, displaced, until they found refuge with the Mthethwa people, a larger and more powerful clan led by a chief named Dingiswayo. Dingiswayo was unlike most chiefs of his time. He was a visionary, a man who believed that the scattered clans of the region could be united under a single political structure. He did not rule through terror or tribute alone. He ruled through diplomacy, strategic marriages, and the careful cultivation of alliances. He also maintained a formidable standing army, one that did not disband after each harvest season, but remained ready, trained, and loyal. It was here, under Dingiswayo's protection, that Shaka's life began to change. He was conscripted into the Mthethwa military, joining a regiment of young men known as an Ibutho. For the first time in his life, Shaka was given structure, purpose, and the tools to prove himself. And prove himself he did. Shaka was not the fastest runner. He was not the strongest man, but he was the most observant. He noticed inefficiencies that others accepted as tradition. He saw that the long-throwing spear, the assegai, was a flawed weapon. Warriors would throw it once, lose it, and then have nothing left but a club or their fists. Battles became chaotic melees where luck mattered more than skill. Shaka began to experiment. He trained with a shorter spear, one that could be used for stabbing rather than throwing. He practiced close-quarters combat, moving in tight, controlled bursts. He trained his body to endure pain, to ignore fear, to function as a machine. Where other warriors saw battle as a test of courage, Shaka saw it as a problem to be solved. His superiors noticed. Dingiswayo himself took an interest in the young warrior who fought with such precision, such intensity. Shaka rose quickly through the ranks, earning a reputation not for bravery, though he had that in abundance, but for something rarer, effectiveness. He was not loved, he was not celebrated, but he was respected. And for a man who had spent his childhood as an outcast, respect was a currency more valuable than gold. By the time Shaka reached his mid-20s, he had become one of Dingiswayo's most trusted commanders. He had seen dozens of battles. He had studied the tactics of neighboring clans. He had analyzed the strengths and weaknesses of every fighting style in the region, and he had come to a singular, terrifying conclusion. War, as it was currently practiced, was a waste, a ritual, a performance. But it didn't have to be. War could be something else entirely. It could be a tool of transformation, a force that could take fragmented, feuding clans and hammer them into a single, unified power. War could build empires. All it required was the will to reimagine it, and the ruthlessness to enforce that vision. Shaka did not yet have an army of his own. He did not yet have a throne, but he had something more dangerous than either, a plan. And soon, very soon, fate would give him the opportunity to execute it. In 1816, word reached Shaka that his father, Senzangakona, chief of the Zulu clan, had died. For most men, this would have been a moment of grief, perhaps even closure. For Shaka, it was an opportunity. Senzangakona had ruled the Zulu people for decades, but his was a modest chieftainship. The Zulu were not a powerful clan. They numbered perhaps 1,500 people at most, spread across a handful of homesteads in the hills north of the White Mfolozi River. They were vassals of Dingiswayo's Mthethwa Confederation, tributary but not insignificant. Still, by the standards of the region, they were small. Upon Senzangakona's death, the chieftainship passed to his eldest legitimate son, Sigujana. This was tradition. This was law. Shaka, the bastard, the exile, had no claim. But Shaka had never cared much for tradition, and he had Dingiswayo's backing. The details of what happened next are murky, filtered through generations of oral history and colonial retellings. But the outcome is clear. Sigujana did not rule for long. Within months, he was dead. Some sources say he was assassinated by Shaka's supporters. Others suggest he was killed in a dispute that Shaka orchestrated from a distance. What matters is this. By the end of 1816, Shaka Senzangakona was chief of the Zulu clan. He was 30 years old, and he had just inherited a kingdom the size of a village. Shaka did not waste time mourning his half-brother or honoring the old ways. The moment he took power, he began to dismantle the clan's existing structures and rebuild them according to his own design. His first act was to reorganize the military. The Zulu, like most clans, had relied on age-based regiments, groups of young men who trained together, fought together, and then returned to their homesteads to marry and farm. This system was inefficient. It created soldiers who were part-time warriors, more concerned with cattle and family than with discipline and loyalty. Shaka abolished it. In its place, he created a standing army. Young men were conscripted into regiments and forbidden from marrying until they had proven themselves in battle. They lived in military barracks, trained daily, and answered only to Shaka. Their loyalty was not to their families or their homesteads, it was to the Zulu nation. And the Zulu nation was Shaka. This was revolutionary. No other clan in the region maintained a permanent military force, Most chiefs could barely muster a few hundred warriors for a single campaign. Shaka, within months, had thousands of men who lived, breathed, and existed solely for war. But manpower alone was not enough. Shaka understood that wars were won not by the number of soldiers, but by the quality of their training and the superiority of their tactics. And so he turned his attention to the weapons. The traditional weapon of war in southern Africa was the assegai, a long throwing spear with a small iron blade. Warriors would carry several of these spears into battle, hurl them at their enemies from a distance, and then retreat or engage in chaotic hand-to-hand combat with whatever remained. Shaka hated this system. He saw it as cowardly and inefficient. Why throw your weapon away when you could keep it and kill more effectively up close? He commissioned blacksmiths to forge a new type of spear, shorter, heavier, with a broad, leaf-shaped blade designed for stabbing rather than throwing. This weapon would come to be known as the Iklwa, named for the sucking sound it made when pulled from a victim's body. The Iklwa was not just a weapon, it was a philosophy. It represented Shaka's belief that war should be personal, brutal, and decisive. No more standing at a distance, no more throwing spears and hoping for a lucky hit. Shaka's warriors would close the gap, drive the blade into their enemy's torso, and move on to the next target. Efficient, ruthless, final. But a weapon is only as good as the man wielding it, and so Shaka drilled his soldiers relentlessly. Shaka's training regimen was unlike anything the region had ever seen. His soldiers ran barefoot across rocky terrain to toughen their feet. They trained for hours in the sun without water to build endurance. They practiced formations until they could execute them in their sleep. And they fought in mock battles where failure meant punishment, beatings, humiliation, sometimes death. Shaka did not believe in half measures. He believed that fear and discipline were the twin pillars of an effective army. His soldiers feared him more than they feared the enemy, and that fear made them unstoppable. He also introduced new tactics. The most famous of these was the Impondo Zinkomo, or Horns of the Buffalo. It was a formation that would become synonymous with Zulu warfare for decades to come. The army was divided into 4 sections. The chest, the main body of warriors, would engage the enemy head-on, drawing their attention and locking them in place. Meanwhile, the 2 horns, flanking units, would sweep around the sides and encircle the enemy from behind. The lowen, a reserve force, would wait behind the chest, ready to reinforce or exploit any weakness. By the time the enemy realized they were surrounded, it was too late. Escape was impossible. Surrender was not accepted. This was not war as ritual. This was war as extermination. With his army trained and his tactics refined, Shaka launched his first campaigns. His targets were the smaller clans that bordered Zulu territory, groups that had once seen the Zulu as peers, perhaps even inferiors. They were not prepared for what came next. Shaka's warriors moved with speed and coordination that seemed almost supernatural. They struck at dawn, encircled their enemies before they could form ranks, and cut them down with the Iklwa before they had time to throw a single spear. Those who survived were given a choice: submit to Zulu rule or die. Most submitted. But submission in Shaka's world did not mean subjugation. It meant assimilation. Defeated clans were not enslaved or humiliated. They were absorbed. Their young men were conscripted into Zulu regiments. Their chiefs were allowed to keep their titles, provided they swore loyalty to Shaka. Their cattle, their land, their identity, all of it became part of the growing Zulu state. This was not conquest for the sake of tribute. This was conquest for the sake of unification. Shaka was not building an empire of vassals. He was building a nation. Throughout these early campaigns, Shaka remained a vassal of Dingiswayo and the Mthethwa Confederation. He owed his position, in part, to Dingiswayo's patronage, and he was careful not to overstep. Not yet. But in 1817, everything changed. Dingiswayo, the man who had protected Shaka, who had given him a place in the world, was killed. He had been captured by Zwide, chief of the Ndwanwe people, one of the Mthethwa's great rivals. Zwide had Dingiswayo executed and sent his head back to the Mthethwa as a message. The Mthethwa Confederation collapsed almost immediately. Without Dingiswayo's leadership, the alliance fractured. Clans that had once been united under his banner now scrambled for survival. Chaos spread across the region like wildfire, and in the midst of that chaos, Shaka saw his chance. With Dingiswayo dead, Shaka was no longer a subordinate. He was a warlord in his own right, and he wasted no time asserting his dominance. He moved quickly to absorb the remnants of the Mfecane Confederation. Some clans joined him willingly, recognizing that Shaka's Zulu kingdom was now the strongest power in the region. Others resisted. They were crushed. Shaka's army, now numbering in the thousands, swept through the hills and valleys of KwaZulu-Natal like a storm. Every victory brought more warriors, more cattle, more land. The Zulu were no longer a small clan. They were becoming a force that could challenge the greatest powers in southern Africa. But Shaka knew that growth alone was not enough. To survive, to truly dominate, he would need to face the one enemy that threatened everything he had built, Zwaide and the Ndwandwe. The war that was coming would determine whether Shaka's vision would endure or be crushed beneath the weight of a superior foe. By 1818, Shaka had transformed the Zulu from a minor clan into a rising regional power. But he was not the only warlord with ambitions. To the north, Zwaide Kalenga, chief of the Ndwandwe people, commanded an army that dwarfed Shaka's. The Ndwandwe were one of the most powerful groups in the region, with a military tradition that stretched back generations. They had crushed Dingiswayo, they had scattered the Mthethwa, and now they turned their attention to the upstart Zulu. Zwaide did not see Shaka as a threat. He saw him as an annoyance, a former vassal who had grown too bold, too loud. The solution was simple: march south, destroy the Zulu, and remind the region who truly ruled. Shaka, for his part, knew the war was coming. He had been preparing for it since the day he took power, but he also knew that he could not defeat the Ndwandwe in a direct confrontation. Not yet. They outnumbered him. They had more warriors, more cattle, more resources. If he met them head-on, he would lose. So Shaka did something that no other chief would have dared. He abandoned the old rules of warfare entirely, and in doing so, he changed the course of history. When Zwaide's army began its march south in 1818, they expected to find the Zulu waiting for them, defending their territory, their homesteads, their honor. Instead, they found nothing. Shaka had ordered a full evacuation. Every man, woman, and child in Zulu territory was to pack what they could carry and move south, into the hills and valleys where the Ndwandwe could not easily follow. Livestock were driven ahead of them. Grain stores were buried or burned. Homesteads were abandoned. And as the Ndwandwe advanced, they found themselves marching through a wasteland. No food, no water, no one to fight. Just empty kraals and silent hills. This was psychological warfare. Shaka was not just denying the Ndwandwe a battle, he was denying them sustenance. Every mile they marched, they grew weaker. Their supply lines stretched. Their warriors grew hungry and demoralized. And all the while, Shaka's scouts watched from the ridges, reporting every movement, every weakness. The Ndwandwe pushed deeper into Zulu territory, expecting that Shaka would eventually be forced to stand and fight. But Shaka had no intention of fighting on their terms. After weeks of pursuing the Zulu through barren land, the Ndwandwe army was exhausted. Their warriors had been marching and fighting for months. They were low on supplies, morale was collapsing, and Zwaide's commanders were beginning to question the campaign. It was then that Shaka struck. He chose his ground carefully, a hill called Gokli, steep and defensible, with clear sight lines in every direction. He positioned his warriors at the top and waited. When the Ndwandwe approached, they saw the Zulu army arrayed before them, shields locked, spears ready. Finally, a battle. The Ndwandwe charged up the hill, confident in their superior numbers, but the terrain worked against them. They could not bring their full force to bear. They could not flank. They could not maneuver. And as they climbed, Shaka's warriors met them with the Iklwa. The battle was brutal. The Ndwandwe fought hard, but they were exhausted, starving, and fighting uphill. Shaka's forces, by contrast, were rested, disciplined, and fighting on ground of their choosing. The buffalo horn formation, which had proven so effective in smaller engagements, was adapted to the terrain. The chest held the center. The horns swept down the slopes and attacked the Ndwandwe flanks, and the Lowans, held in reserve, surged forward to finish the job. By the time the sun set, the Ndwandwe were in full retreat. Thousands had been killed. The survivors fled north, broken and leaderless. Zwide's reputation was shattered, but Shaka was not done. Shaka did not allow the Ndwandwe to retreat in peace. He ordered his warriors to pursue them, to hunt them down as they fled. This was not about capturing territory or seizing cattle. This was about sending a message. The Zulu warriors pursued the Ndwandwe for miles, cutting down stragglers, burning their homesteads, scattering their clans. It was a campaign of annihilation, designed not just to defeat an enemy, but to erase them as a viable threat. And it worked. Within a year, the Ndwandwe Confederation had collapsed. Zwide fled north, eventually dying in exile. The clans that had once sworn loyalty to him either submitted to Shaka or were destroyed. The balance of power in southern Africa had shifted, and at the center of that shift was a single man, Shaka Zulu. The victory over the Ndwandwe established Shaka as the most powerful warlord in the region. But more than that, it established a new way of thinking about war itself. Shaka did not see war as a seasonal activity or a test of courage. He saw it as a tool of statecraft, a means to an end, and the end was total dominance. He believed that wars should be fought not to achieve limited objectives, but to destroy the enemy's capacity to resist. He believed that mercy was a weakness, that hesitation was fatal, and that the only way to ensure lasting peace was through overwhelming, undeniable victory. This philosophy terrified his neighbors, but it also attracted them. Clans that might have resisted Shaka now flocked to him, seeking his protection, his leadership, his strength. The Zulu kingdom was no longer just a military power. It was becoming a political magnet, and Shaka, once an outcast with no name and no future, was becoming a legend. Shaka's military success was not just about tactics and weapons, it was about discipline. And discipline in Shaka's world was absolute. His soldiers were expected to obey without question, to fight without fear, and to die if necessary without complaint. Those who showed cowardice were executed publicly, often by their own comrades. Those who failed in their duties were beaten, humiliated, or expelled from their regiments. There was no room for weakness in Shaka's army. Only strength, loyalty, and obedience. But discipline alone does not create loyalty. Shaka understood this. He also understood that soldiers fight not just out of fear, but out of pride, ambition, and the promise of reward. And so, alongside his brutal punishments, Shaka instituted a system of merit-based advancement. Warriors who distinguished themselves in battle were promoted. Those who showed exceptional skill or bravery were given cattle, status, and the right to marry. The most elite regiments were granted special privileges, including distinctive shields and headdresses that marked them as the best of the best. This combination of fear and incentive created an army unlike any other in Africa. Shaka's warriors were not just soldiers. They were instruments of his will, and they were unstoppable. The buffalo horn formation, which Shaka had refined over years of experimentation, became the signature tactic of the Zulu army. It was simple in concept, but devastatingly effective in execution. The formation worked like this. The chest, composed of the most experienced warriors, would engage the enemy directly, locking them in place. The horns, typically made up of younger, faster soldiers, would sprint around the sides and attack from the flanks or rear. The Lowans, held in reserve, would either reinforce the chest or pursue fleeing enemies. But the true genius of the formation was not in its structure. It was in its flexibility. Shaka trained his commanders to adapt the formation to any terrain, any enemy, any situation. On open plains, the horns could sweep wide and encircle entire armies. In hilly terrain, the chest could hold high ground while the horns attacked from the slopes. Against superior numbers, the Lowans could be deployed as a defensive wall, preventing the enemy from breaking through. This adaptability gave the Zulu a tactical edge that their enemies simply could not match. Other armies fought according to tradition, according to ritual. The Zulu fought according to strategy, and strategy won. To his warriors, Shaka was both a hero and a tyrant. He led from the front in battle, exposing himself to the same dangers as his soldiers. He ate the same food, slept on the same ground, and endured the same hardships. This earned him a degree of respect that no amount of fear could produce. But Shaka was also merciless. He did not tolerate failure. He did not forgive weakness. And he did not hesitate to execute those who displeased him, even if they were his most trusted commanders. This combination of charisma and cruelty made him a leader who was impossible to ignore. His soldiers feared him, but they also believed in him. They believed that he was building something greater than any of them could achieve alone, and they were willing to die for that belief. Because Shaka had given them something that no other chief had ever offered: purpose. The Zulu were no longer just a clan, they were a nation, and Shaka was their king. But innovation, especially in war, comes at a cost. Shaka's reforms had transformed the Zulu into a military superpower, but they had also created a society that existed almost entirely for war. Young men spent their best years in barracks, training and fighting, forbidden from marrying or starting families. Women worked the fields and tended the homesteads, bearing the burden of sustaining a kingdom that was constantly at war. The Zulu economy, such as it was, ran on captured cattle and tribute from subjugated clans. There was little trade, little agriculture beyond subsistence farming. Everything revolved around the army. Everything revolved around conquest. This was not sustainable, and on some level Shaka must have known it, but he was not interested in sustainability. He was interested in dominance. And dominance, in his world, meant endless expansion. The question was not whether the Zulu would continue to grow. The question was how far they could grow before the system collapsed under its own weight. For now, though, that question could wait, because Shaka had a kingdom to build. And kingdoms, he was learning, were built not just through conquest, but through unification. By 1820, Shaka controlled more territory than any chief in the region's history. His army numbered in the tens of thousands. His influence stretched from the coast to the interior, from the Thucula River to the Pongola. But controlling territory and building a nation are two different things. Shaka understood this. He knew that raw military power could conquer, but it could not govern. He needed more than fear. He needed legitimacy. He needed systems. He needed a state. And so, even as he continued to wage war on the frontiers, Shaka turned his attention inward. He began the work of transforming a collection of subjugated clans into a single, unified Zulu nation. This was not a process of gentle persuasion. It was a process of erasure and reconstruction. One of Shaka's most radical innovations was his deliberate dismantling of traditional clan structures. In the old system, loyalty was first to one's family, then to one's clan, and only distantly to a regional chief. This made coalitions fragile and alliances temporary. Clans could be bought, bribed, or scared into submission, but they rarely stayed loyal for long. Shaka refused to accept this. He wanted soldiers and subjects who identified not as members of a particular clan, but as Zulu. And so he set about systematically breaking down the old identities. When a clan was defeated and absorbed, its young men were not allowed to remain together. Instead, they were scattered across different regiments, mixed with warriors from other clans, forced to train, fight, and live alongside people who had once been their rivals. Over time, the bonds of regiment replaced the bonds of kinship. Warriors stopped thinking of themselves as Mthethwa, or Kwabe, or Langeni. They thought of themselves as Zulu. This was cultural engineering on a massive scale, and it worked. The regiments, or Amabuto, became the backbone of Shaka's state. Each regiment was given a name, a distinct shield pattern, and a reputation to uphold. They competed with one another for honor, for glory, for the favor of the king. This competition created a culture of excellence. Warriors trained harder because they did not want to shame their regiment. They fought harder because they wanted to prove their regiment was the best. But the regiments were more than just military units. They were also instruments of social control. By forbidding warriors to marry until they had proven themselves in battle, Shaka ensured that young men remained loyal to the state rather than to their families. By keeping them in barracks for years at a time, he prevented them from developing regional loyalties. The warrior's world was the army, and the army's world was Shaka. This system was brutal. It denied young men the normal rhythms of life, marriage, children, land. But it also gave them something intoxicating: glory, the chance to be part of something greater, the chance to make history. And for many, that was enough. Shaka's approach to conquered peoples was unusual for his time. He did not enslave them, nor did he demand tribute and then leave them to govern themselves. Instead, he absorbed them completely. Defeated clans were allowed to keep their chiefs, but those chiefs now answered to Shaka. Their warriors became Zulu warriors. Their cattle became Zulu cattle. Their land became Zulu land. In exchange, they received protection, access to a larger economy, and a share in the spoils of future conquests. This was not generosity, it was pragmatism. Shaka understood that empires built on subjugation alone were fragile. He needed people to believe, or at least to accept, that they were part of something larger, that their interests and the Zulu state's interests were aligned. And to a surprising degree, it worked. Many of the clans that Shaka conquered in the early years of his reign became some of his most loyal subjects. They fought for him not because they were forced to, but because they had been given a place in the new order. A place that, for all its harshness, offered more stability and opportunity than the chaos of the pre-Shaka world. Shaka's reputation as a military genius is well earned, but he was also a skilled diplomat, capable of using words as effectively as spears when the situation called for it. Not every clan was conquered by force. Some submitted voluntarily, recognizing that resistance was futile. Shaka encouraged this. He sent emissaries to neighboring chiefs, offering them a choice: join the Zulu willingly and retain your status, or resist and be destroyed. The message was clear, but it was also rational. Why fight a war you cannot win? Many chiefs chose submission, and Shaka, true to his word, allowed them to keep their titles and their cattle, provided they sent their young men to serve in the Zulu army and acknowledged Shaka as their sovereign. This combination of diplomacy and intimidation allowed Shaka to expand his kingdom rapidly and with less bloodshed than might otherwise have been necessary. He was building an empire, yes, but he was also building a consensus, a belief, however reluctant, that the Zulu state was inevitable. As the Zulu kingdom grew, Shaka faced a problem that had plagued every empire in history: how to maintain control over a vast and diverse population. He solved this through centralization. All decisions of consequence flowed through Shaka. He did not delegate power to regional governors or allow his generals to operate independently. He kept his commanders close, rotating them frequently to prevent them from building personal power bases. He maintained a network of spies and informants who reported directly to him, ensuring that he was always aware of dissent, disloyalty, or rebellion. This system was effective, but it was also exhausting. Shaka was the state. Every policy, every campaign, every decision depended on him, and as the kingdom grew, so did the burden. But for now, Shaka seemed tireless. He rose before dawn, held court throughout the day, planned campaigns into the night. He was everywhere, seeing everything, controlling everything. His presence was the glue that held the kingdom together, and his subjects, whether they loved him or feared him, could not imagine the Zulu without him. Shaka's reforms extended beyond the military. He also reshaped Zulu society in ways that would endure long after his death. He standardized marriage practices, creating a system where young men could only marry after completing military service and receiving permission from the king. This gave Shaka control over the most intimate aspects of his subjects' lives, but it also created a meritocracy of sorts. Those who fought well and served loyally were rewarded with cattle and the right to start families. Those who did not were left behind. He also reorganized the homestead structure. In the traditional system, extended families lived together in dispersed kraals, each relatively autonomous. Shaka centralized this, creating larger settlements with more direct oversight from the state. He built royal kraals, massive complexes that served as administrative centers, military bases, and symbols of Zulu power. The most famous of these was Kwa Bulawayo, Shaka's primary residence. It was said to house thousands of people: warriors, advisors, servants, wives. It was a city in its own right, a testament to the scale of what Shaka had built. As Shaka's power grew, so did the mythology surrounding him. He was no longer just a chief, he was becoming something more. A symbol, a god king. Stories spread throughout the kingdom. Tales of his invincibility in battle, his supernatural insight, his ability to see through lies and read the hearts of men. Some of these stories were true, many were exaggerations, but Shaka encouraged them all. He understood the power of myth. He understood that a king who was merely powerful could be challenged, but a king who was believed to be something more than human, something touched by the ancestors, something divine, was unchallengeable. Shaka cultivated this image deliberately. He held elaborate ceremonies where he would commune with the spirits of his ancestors. He delivered prophecies that seemed to come true. He demonstrated his physical prowess in public displays, wrestling bulls, running marathons alongside his youngest warriors. He wore elaborate regalia, feathers, skins, ornaments, that set him apart from every other man in the kingdom. And his subjects for the most part believed, or at least they acted as though they believed, which in the end was the same thing. But not everyone saw Shaka's rise as a positive development. His former allies, the chiefs who had supported him in his early campaigns, who had benefited from his victories, began to grow uneasy. They had expected Shaka to be a strong leader, yes, but they had not expected him to become this. A king who tolerated no equals. A king who saw every neighboring power as either a subject or an enemy. A king who seemed to believe that the natural order of things was Zulu dominance over all. Chiefs who had once fought alongside Shaka now found themselves marginalized. Their autonomy slowly eroded, their warriors absorbed into Zulu regiments. They could not openly rebel. Shaka's army was too strong, his intelligence network too thorough. But they could watch and wait and wonder how long this could last. Even within the Zulu royal family, tensions were rising. Shaka's half-brothers, the sons of Senzangakona, who had legitimate claims to power, were kept at arm's length. They held positions of honor but no real authority. They commanded regiments but only at Shaka's pleasure. They were princes in name, but prisoners in practice, and they were growing restless. Shaka's military expansion had consequences far beyond the borders of his kingdom. As the Zulu absorbed clan after clan, the displaced populations had nowhere to go. Refugees fled in every direction, north, south, west, carrying with them stories of the unstoppable Zulu army and the king who commanded it. This migration triggered a cascade of violence that would come to be known as the Mfecane, or the crushing. Displaced clans invaded the territories of their neighbors, who in turn were displaced and invaded others. The violence spread like ripples on a pond, destabilizing an area the size of Western Europe. Some of the refugees formed their own military states, modeling themselves on Shaka Zulu. Mzilikazi, a former Zulu general who fled after a dispute with Shaka, went on to found the Matabele kingdom in what is now Zimbabwe. Soshangan carved out a kingdom in Mozambique. Zwangandaba led his people on a decades-long migration that took them as far north as Tanzania. The Mfecane would reshape southern Africa for generations, and at the center of it all was Shaka. He had not intended to cause such widespread upheaval, but he had created a military system so effective, so terrifying, that it could not be contained. It spread, mutated, and replicated itself across the continent. Shaka had not just built a kingdom, he had unleashed a revolution. The Zulu economy, such as it was, depended almost entirely on conquest. Cattle, the primary measure of wealth in the region, were seized from defeated enemies and distributed among the warriors. Land was taken and redistributed. Grain stores were confiscated. The spoils of war fueled the war machine, which in turn generated more spoils. This was not a sustainable economic model. It required constant expansion, constant victory, constant tribute. The moment the Zulu stopped conquering, the entire system would begin to collapse. Warriors would have nothing to fight for. Subjects would have nothing to gain. The loyalty that Shaka had purchased with cattle and glory would evaporate. Shaka must have understood this, but he showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, the pace of expansion accelerated. By 1824, the Zulu controlled an area roughly the size of modern-day Austria, and Shaka was already planning his next campaigns. But there was a problem. He was running out of enemies. To the south and west, the Zulu borders pressed against the territories of the Xhosa and the advancing Cape Colony. European settlers whose military technology was beginning to rival and in some ways surpass that of the Zulu. To the north, the remnants of the Ndwandwe and other displaced groups had fled beyond easy reach. And within the borders of the Zulu kingdom, there were few clans left to conquer. Shaka had built a war machine without an off switch, and now with fewer wars to fight, the machine was beginning to turn on itself. As the decade of the 1820s progressed, Shaka's behavior began to change. He had always been ruthless, but now there was an edge of paranoia to his rule. He saw threats everywhere, in the eyes of his generals, in the whispers of his advisors, in the silence of his subjects. Executions, which had once been reserved for cowards and traitors, became more frequent and more arbitrary. A soldier who failed to show proper respect could be killed on the spot. A chief who arrived late to court could be accused of disloyalty and executed along with his family. Even Shaka's closest companions were not safe. He tested their loyalty constantly, setting traps, asking impossible questions, watching for signs of hesitation or doubt. This atmosphere of fear kept the kingdom in line, but it also bred resentment. Loyalty born of terror is fragile, and Shaka, for all his genius, did not seem to realize that he was slowly eroding the very foundation of his power. In 1824, a group of European traders arrived on the coast near what is now Durban. They were representatives of the British Crown, seeking to establish a trading post and explore the interior. They had heard rumors of a powerful African king who controlled vast territories and commanded a fearsome army. They came seeking trade, diplomacy, and perhaps a bit of adventure. What they found was Shaka. The Europeans were received with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. Shaka was fascinated by their technology, their guns, their ships, their tools. He saw in them both an opportunity and a threat. An opportunity because their weapons could make his army even more powerful. A threat because their presence signaled the beginning of something larger, something beyond his control. The traders, for their part, were awed by what they saw. They marveled at the size and discipline of Shaka's army. They witnessed military drills that seemed almost choreographed in their precision. They attended ceremonies where thousands of warriors danced and chanted in perfect unison. And they left with accounts that would, over time, shape European perceptions of Africa and its rulers. Shaka was generous with the traders. He gave them land to build their settlement. He provided them with cattle and protection, but he also kept them at a distance. He did not trust them, and he made sure they knew it. They were guests, nothing more. Still, the arrival of the Europeans was significant. It marked the beginning of a new era, one in which African kingdoms like the Zulu would have to contend not just with each other, but with powers from across the ocean. Powers with resources, ambitions, and technologies that no African king, no matter how brilliant, could fully comprehend. Shaka understood this, at least in part. He knew that the world was changing. He knew that his kingdom, for all its strength, was not invincible. But he also believed that he could adapt, that he could learn from the Europeans, take what was useful, and discard the rest. He was wrong, but he would not live long enough to see just how wrong he was. By 1826, Shaka Zulu stood at the height of his power. He ruled over a kingdom that stretched across thousands of square miles. His army, now numbering close to 50,000 warriors, was the most formidable fighting force in southern Africa. His name was spoken in whispers from the Cape to the Zambezi. He was feared, respected, and utterly dominant. He had achieved what no other African leader of his time had managed: the creation of a centralized, militarized state capable of projecting power over vast distances. He had taken the scattered clans of KwaZulu-Natal and forged them into a nation. He had revolutionized the art of war. He had built an empire. But empires, as history has shown again and again, are easier to build than to maintain. And Shaka, for all his brilliance, was about to discover that the same qualities that made him a conqueror, his ruthlessness, his single-mindedness, his refusal to compromise, would also be his undoing. Because the true test of a king is not how he rises to power. It is how he holds it. And Shaka was about to face a test that even he could not pass. To understand the Zulu kingdom at its height is to understand a society built entirely around the projection of power. By the mid-1820s, Shaka's state had become a machine of almost terrifying efficiency. Every aspect of life, from agriculture to marriage to religion, was organized to support the military, and the military existed to expand and defend the kingdom. But this was not a kingdom of chaos or barbarism, as some European accounts would later claim. It was a kingdom of order. Brutal order, yes, but order nonetheless. The Zulu state had laws, courts, and administrators. Disputes were settled through a system of councils and appeals. Justice was swift and often harsh, but it was predictable. If you knew the rules, you could navigate the system, and the rules, for all their severity, were clear. Shaka himself presided over the most important cases. He would sit in the royal kraal, surrounded by his advisors and generals, and listen as parties presented their arguments. His judgments were final. There was no appeal beyond the king, but those who experienced Shaka's justice often remarked on his shrewdness, his ability to see through lies, his understanding of human nature. He was in many ways a legalist. He believed in rules, in systems, in predictability. The irony, of course, was that he also believed those rules should bend to his will whenever convenient. Shaka's kingdom was divided into regions, each overseen by a chief who answered directly to the king. These chiefs were responsible for collecting tribute, settling minor disputes, and ensuring that young men reported for military service when called. But Shaka did not trust regional autonomy. He rotated chiefs frequently, moving them from one territory to another to prevent them from building local power bases. He also maintained a network of spies, trusted individuals who traveled the kingdom, listened to conversations, and reported any signs of dissent or disloyalty. This system was exhausting to maintain. It required constant vigilance, constant communication, constant intervention. But it worked. The Zulu kingdom, despite its size, remained remarkably centralized. Shaka's word was law, and his law reached every corner of the realm. The Zulu economy was relatively simple. It was based on cattle, agriculture, and tribute. Cattle were the primary measure of wealth and status. They were used as currency, as dowries, as rewards for military service. A man's worth was measured by the size of his herd. Agriculture was subsistence-based. Women tended the fields, growing maize, sorghum, and vegetables. Men herded cattle, hunted, and trained for war. There was little specialization, little trade beyond the exchange of cattle and basic goods. But with the arrival of the European traders in 1824, this began to change. The Europeans brought goods that the Zulu had never seen before: metal tools, cloth, beads, and most significantly, firearms. Shaka was keenly interested in these items, especially the guns. He understood that European weapons could give his army an even greater advantage. But firearms at this stage were not game changers. They were slow to reload, inaccurate, and prone to malfunction. The Iklwa, in the hands of a well-trained Zulu warrior, was often more effective in close combat. Still, Shaka accumulated guns when he could, seeing them as symbols of modernity and potential tools for future campaigns. The Europeans, for their part, wanted ivory and cattle. They established a trading post at Port Natal, later known as Durban, and began a cautious relationship with the Zulu kingdom. Shaka allowed this trade, but he controlled it tightly. No European was permitted to travel into the interior without his permission. No trade occurred without his knowledge. This was not an economic partnership. It was a relationship of convenience, managed by a king who understood that the Europeans could be useful but also dangerous. Life in the Zulu kingdom was highly regimented, especially for young men. Boys were raised with the expectation that they would one day serve in the army. At around the age of 15, they were conscripted into age-based regiments and sent to military kraals for training. There, they learned to fight, to march, to endure hardship. They were forbidden from marrying until their regiment was granted permission by the king, a process that could take years, even decades. This system kept young men dependent on Shaka for their future prospects. Marriage, family, land, all of these required the king's blessing. Women, meanwhile, maintained the homesteads. They farmed, raised children, brewed beer, and manage the day-to-day life of the kingdom. They had no formal role in the military or in governance, but they were far from powerless. Women owned property, controlled household resources, and played key roles in religious and cultural rituals. Shaka himself never married, at least not in the traditional sense. He had numerous women in his household, and they bore him children, but he never elevated any woman to the status of queen or chief wife. Some historians believe this was a deliberate choice, a way of preventing the emergence of rival power centers within the royal family. Others suggest that Shaka, scarred by his mother's treatment and his own illegitimacy, simply did not trust the institution of marriage. The Zulu, like most southern African peoples, believed in a supreme creator god, Unkulunkulu, as well as a pantheon of ancestral spirits who could influence the living world. Ancestors were honored through rituals, sacrifices, and offerings. They were believed to watch over their descendants, offering protection and guidance. Shaka participated in these rituals, but his relationship with religion was complex. He used it when convenient, invoking the ancestors to legitimize his rule, consulting diviners to reinforce his decisions. But he also seemed skeptical of much of it. He was known to mock diviners who failed to provide useful information, and he executed more than one who gave him prophecies he did not like. Still, religion served a purpose in the Zulu state. It provided continuity, a link between the past and the present. It reinforced social norms and offered explanations for misfortune, and in a kingdom built on conquest and violence, it provided a way for people to make sense of their suffering. The European traders at Port Natal were both fascinated and disturbed by Shaka. They sent detailed accounts back to the Cape Colony, describing the Zulu king as a military genius, a tyrant, a visionary, and a savage, often all in the same letter. One of the most detailed accounts came from a trader named Henry Francis Finn, who met Shaka in 1824 and spent several years in the Zulu kingdom. Finn described Shaka as physically imposing, intelligent, and utterly self-assured. He noted Shaka's curiosity about European technology, his sharp wit, and his ability to command absolute obedience from his subjects. But Finn also described the executions, the arbitrary justice, the atmosphere of fear that permeated the royal court. He witnessed Shaka order the deaths of people for trivial offenses, or for no offense at all. He saw soldiers executed for showing fear in battle, chiefs killed for arriving late to a summons, women and children put to death for crying too loudly at funerals. Finn's accounts, and others like them, would shape European perceptions of Shaka for generations. They painted him as a brilliant but brutal ruler, a man capable of great achievements but also terrible cruelty. And while these accounts were not entirely inaccurate, they also reflected the biases and limitations of their authors. Men who viewed African societies through the lens of colonial superiority, who saw order as evidence of genius and violence as evidence of savagery. Shaka, for his part, seems to have viewed the Europeans with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. He was impressed by their technology but unimpressed by their lack of military discipline. He valued them as sources of information and goods, but he did not see them as equals. They were, in his mind, useful, but not essential. This would prove to be a miscalculation, because while Shaka was consolidating his power in the interior, the Europeans were consolidating theirs on the coast. And the two worlds, African and European, were on a collision course that no single king, no matter how brilliant, could prevent. By 1827, the Zulu army was the most formidable military force in sub-Saharan Africa. It consisted of multiple regiments, each numbering thousands of warriors, each with its own identity, traditions, and reputation. The regiments competed with one another for glory, for favor, for the right to say they were the best. Training was constant and brutal. Warriors drilled daily, practicing formations, perfecting their techniques with the Iklwa, running long distances to build endurance. Those who fell behind were beaten. Those who failed in combat exercises were shamed. The weak did not last long in Shaka's army, but the strong thrived. The Zulu military was a meritocracy in the truest sense. Skill, courage, and loyalty were rewarded with promotion, cattle, and status. A common warrior could rise to become a regimental commander if he proved himself. A former slave could become a trusted general if he fought well enough. This system created a culture of excellence. Zulu warriors were not just soldiers, they were professionals, and they took pride in their professionalism. The army's reputation spread far beyond the borders of the kingdom. Stories of Zulu invincibility became legend. Neighboring chiefs spoke of the Zulu in hushed tones, as though they were forces of nature rather than men. And in a sense, they were. Because the Zulu army was not just a collection of warriors, it was the physical manifestation of Shaka's will. But by the late 1820s, Shaka was running into a problem that all empire builders eventually face: the limits of sustainable expansion. To the south, the Zulu borders pressed against the territories of the Xhosa, the Thembu, and beyond them, the Cape Colony. These groups were either too strong to be easily conquered or protected by European colonial powers. To the north, the landscape became more difficult. Dense bush, malarial swamps, regions where the Zulu military advantages were less pronounced. To the east was the ocean, and to the west the high plateaus of the interior, where the Zulu cavalryless army struggled to operate effectively. Shaka had conquered almost everything within reach, and while he could have continued expanding, grinding down the remaining independent clans, pushing into ever more marginal territories, the returns were diminishing. The cost of campaigning was increasing, while the spoils were decreasing. This created a dilemma. The Zulu economy and social structure depended on constant conquest. Warriors expected rewards, regiments expected glory, subjects expected spoils, but there were fewer and fewer wars to fight. Shaka tried to solve this problem by launching raids into distant territories, sending regiments on long expeditions into Mozambique and beyond. But these campaigns were expensive, exhausting, and often inconclusive. The warriors returned with some cattle and captives, but not enough to satisfy the kingdom's appetite for expansion. The machine that Shaka had built was beginning to consume itself. By 1827, cracks were beginning to show in the facade of Zulu unity. The constant warfare had taken its toll on the population. Young men were tired of spending years in military barracks, forbidden from marrying, watching their youth slip away. Chiefs were tired of Shaka's paranoia, his endless demands, his refusal to share power. Even the royal family was restless. Shaka's half-brothers, Dingaan and Malangana, had spent years in the shadow of their elder brother. They commanded regiments, attended councils, and held positions of honor, but they had no real power. Shaka trusted no one, least of all his own family. He kept them close precisely because he feared them, and they, in turn, feared him. But fear, pushed too far, can transform into something more dangerous: desperation. Still, for now, the system held. Shaka's authority was absolute. His army was loyal. His enemies were cowed. The Zulu kingdom, for all its internal tensions, was at the height of its power. But power, as Shaka would soon discover, is a fragile thing. It can be built over decades and destroyed in an instant. And the higher you rise, the farther you have to fall. The events that would bring about Shaka's downfall were already in motion. They began not with a military defeat or a foreign invasion. They began with something far more personal: the death of the one person Shaka had ever truly loved. In October 1827, Nandi, Shaka's mother, fell ill. She had been in declining health for some time, but now the illness had become serious. Shaka, who had spent his life building an empire, found himself powerless in the face of something no army could fight. Nandi was not just Shaka's mother. She was the one person who had stood by him when the world had rejected him. She had endured exile with him, protected him, raised him in the face of overwhelming humiliation. Everything Shaka had built, the army, the kingdom, the legend he had built in part, for her, to prove that the bastard child she had born was worth something, that he was more than the shame his birth had brought her, and now she was dying. Shaka summoned every healer, every diviner, every expert in traditional medicine he could find. He offered cattle, treasures, anything that might save her, but nothing worked. On October 10, 1827, Nandi died, and something inside Shaka broke. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and horrifying episodes in Zulu history. Shaka, overcome with grief, declared a period of mourning unlike anything the kingdom had ever seen. He ordered that no crops were to be planted for a full year. No milk was to be consumed, milk being a staple of the Zulu diet. Any woman found pregnant during the mourning period was to be killed, along with her husband, because it would suggest that they had not been sufficiently consumed by grief to abstain from intimacy. Thousands of cattle were slaughtered as sacrifices to accompany Nandi into the afterlife. The royal kraal became a place of wailing and lamentation. Warriors were forced to weep openly, to demonstrate their sorrow. Those whose grief seemed insufficient were executed on the spot. But this was not just mourning. This was madness. Shaka's grief transformed into rage. He lashed out at everyone around him. Servants were killed for failing to cry convincingly. Chiefs were executed for showing up late to the funeral rites. Anyone who did not demonstrate absolute, overwhelming sorrow was deemed disloyal and put to death. The European traders observing from Port Natal were horrified. Henry Francis Finn later wrote that over 7,000 people were killed during the mourning period, a number that may have been exaggerated but speaks to the scale of the violence. The kingdom descended into chaos as people fled their homes, fearing that any perceived slight could result in death. But even mass executions were not enough to satisfy Shaka's anguish. He decided that the only way to honor his mother was through blood. He ordered his regiments to launch raids against neighboring territories, not for cattle or land, but simply to kill, to create mourning in other families, so that the world would feel a fraction of the pain he was feeling. Several regiments were sent north, into territories that had already been subjugated. They were ordered to attack villages, burn homesteads, slaughter cattle, and kill anyone who resisted. The raids served no strategic purpose. They were acts of pure destruction, born from a king's inability to process his own grief. The warriors obeyed, but with growing unease. They had fought many battles for Shaka, had killed many enemies. But this was different. This was not war. This was slaughter, and it served no purpose beyond satisfying a madman's pain. The raids continued for months, and with each passing week, Shaka's behavior grew more erratic, his demands more irrational, his punishments more severe. By mid-1828, the Zulu kingdom was in crisis. The economy had been devastated by Shaka's mourning decrees. With no planting and no milk, food was scarce. People were starving. The constant executions had created an atmosphere of terror that made governance nearly impossible. Chiefs were afraid to report problems, for fear that Shaka would blame them. Warriors were afraid to speak up, for fear that their words would be misinterpreted as disloyalty. And Shaka, once the brilliant strategist who had unified a nation, had become a tyrant consumed by his own demons. He retreated more and more into the royal kraal, surrounded by a shrinking circle of advisors who were too terrified to contradict him. He stopped consulting his generals, stopped listening to his chiefs. His decisions became arbitrary and contradictory. One day he would declare that the mourning period was over. The next day he would change his mind and order more executions. The machine he had built was breaking down, and the men who had once followed him loyally were beginning to ask themselves a dangerous question. How long could this go on? Among those asking this question were Shaka's half-brothers, Dingane and Mlangana. They had watched Shaka's descent into madness with growing alarm. They had seen the kingdom they had helped build crumble under the weight of their brother's grief, and they had come to a conclusion. Shaka had to go. This was not a decision made lightly. Killing a king was the ultimate act of treason. If they failed, they would be executed, along with their families and anyone associated with them. But if they succeeded, they could save the kingdom, or at least that's what they told themselves. They were not alone in their thinking. A man named Mbofa, one of Shaka's most trusted servants, had also grown disillusioned. Mbofa had served Shaka for years, had carried out countless orders, had been a loyal instrument of the king's will. But he too had seen the madness, and he too believed that Shaka's reign had to end. The three men, Dingaan, Mlangana, and Mbofa, began to plot. They met in secret, whispered in the shadows, planned carefully. They knew they would have only one chance. If Shaka suspected anything, they would be dead before they could act. They waited for the right moment, and in September 1828, that moment came. Shaka had sent several regiments on another raid, this time into the territories to the north. With much of the army away, the royal kraal was less heavily guarded than usual. It was a small window of vulnerability, but it was enough. On September 22nd, 1828, Shaka was sitting near his kraal, meeting with some traders and conducting routine business. He was not in his war regalia. He was not surrounded by his elite bodyguards. He was, for one of the few times in his adult life, relatively alone. Dingaan, Mfecane, and Mbofa approached. They carried short stabbing spears, the very weapon that Shaka had invented, that had made the Zulu army unstoppable. The accounts of what happened next vary depending on the source, but the core narrative is consistent. Mbofa struck first, driving his spear into Shaka's side. Shaka, stunned, tried to defend himself, but Dingaan and Mfecane attacked as well, stabbing him repeatedly. Shaka fell. Blood pooled around him, and as he lay dying, he reportedly said to his assassins, "You will rule over nothing? The white men are coming. They will be your rulers." Whether he actually said this is uncertain, but the prophecy, accurate or not, would haunt the Zulu for generations. Within minutes, Shaka Zulu, the Napoleon of Africa, the king who had forged an empire from nothing, was dead. Dingaan and Mfecane moved quickly to consolidate power. They announced that Shaka had died and that they were assuming leadership of the kingdom. They did not, at first, admit to killing him. Instead, they implied that his death had been natural, or perhaps the result of some unknown conspiracy. But everyone knew the truth. The warriors who had been away on campaign returned to find their king dead and his half-brothers in power. Some regiments were angry, loyal to Shaka even in death. Others were relieved, glad to see the madness end. The kingdom teetered on the edge of civil war. Dingaan, the more politically astute of the two brothers, acted decisively. He began distributing cattle to the warriors, easing the mourning restrictions, promising a return to normalcy. He also quietly had Mfecane killed. Whether Mfecane posed a genuine threat or whether Dingaan simply wanted to eliminate a rival is unclear. But the message was unmistakable. Dingaan was now the sole ruler of the Zulu. The transition was not smooth. Several chiefs challenged Dingaan's legitimacy. Some regiments refused to acknowledge his authority, but Dingaan had control of the royal kraal, command of the largest regiments, and the tacit support of those who had grown tired of Shaka's tyranny. Within months, the crisis had passed. Dingaan was king, and the Zulu kingdom, battered but intact, continued. Shaka's body was buried in secret in an unmarked grave. The exact location was never publicly revealed. Some say it was near his mother's resting place. Others claim it was hidden to prevent enemies or disgruntled subjects from desecrating it. To this day, no one knows for certain where Shaka Zulu is buried. It is one of the enduring mysteries of African history. The man who had built a kingdom, who had changed the face of southern Africa, who had become a legend in his own lifetime, he vanished into the earth without a trace. But his legacy did not vanish with him. Dingaan ruled the Zulu kingdom for more than a decade. He was not the military genius that Shaka had been, but he was a competent administrator and a shrewd politician. He maintained the core structures that Shaka had built: the standing army, the centralized administration, the regimental system. But he also relaxed some of Shaka's harsher policies. He allowed warriors to marry sooner, eased restrictions on agriculture, and sought to reduce the atmosphere of terror that had characterized the final years of Shaka's reign. But Dingaan faced a challenge that Shaka had only begun to confront: the growing presence of European settlers. In the 1830s, a group of Dutch-speaking colonists, known as the Voortrekkers, began migrating into the interior of southern Africa, fleeing British rule at the Cape. They entered Zulu territory in search of land and freedom. Dingaan, like Shaka before him, tried to manage the Europeans through a combination of diplomacy and intimidation. But the Voortrekkers were not traders looking for alliances. They were settlers looking for land, and they were armed with guns, wagons, and a sense of entitlement that made negotiation difficult. In 1838, tensions boiled over. Dingaan ordered the execution of a Voortrekker delegation led by Piet Retief, fearing that the settlers were planning to seize Zulu land. In retaliation, the Voortrekkers launched a military campaign against the Zulu. At the Battle of Blood River in December 1838, a small force of Voortrekkers, armed with rifles and positioned behind a defensive laager of wagons, defeated a massive Zulu army. The battle was a turning point. For the first time, the Zulu military machine, the formation that Shaka had perfected, the tactics that had made the Zulu unstoppable, had been decisively beaten by European firearms and defensive tactics. The myth of Zulu invincibility was shattered. Dingaan survived for a few more years, but his authority was weakened. In 1840, he was overthrown by another of Shaka's half-brothers, Mpande, who allied himself with the Voortrekkers to seize power. Mpande ruled for more than 30 years, maintaining a fragile peace with the European settlers. But the writing was on the wall. The Zulu kingdom, for all its strength, could not hold back the tide of colonialism. In 1879, 50 years after Shaka's death, the Zulu kingdom faced its greatest challenge: war with the British Empire. The British, who had consolidated their control over much of southern Africa, viewed the Zulu as a threat to their colonial ambitions. They issued an ultimatum demanding the disbandment of the Zulu army and the submission of the kingdom to British authority. The Zulu, now ruled by King Cetshwayo, refused. What followed was the Anglo-Zulu War, a conflict that showcased both the enduring brilliance of Shaka's military legacy and the inevitable limitations of traditional African warfare against industrialized colonial powers. At the Battle of Assiniboia in January 1879, a Zulu force of approximately 20,000 warriors annihilated a British column of over 1,700 soldiers. Using tactics that Shaka had pioneered, the buffalo horn formation, disciplined coordination, rapid encirclement, the Zulu achieved one of the most stunning victories of any indigenous African force against a European colonial army. The Iklwa that Shaka had invented still proved deadly. The regimental system he had created still functioned with devastating efficiency. The warriors still charged with the same discipline and courage that had made them legendary. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Zulu military tradition might be unstoppable. But Assiniboia was followed by Rorke's Drift, where a tiny British garrison held off thousands of Zulu warriors through superior firepower in defensive positions. And 6 months later, at the Battle of Ulundi, the British brought overwhelming force, artillery, cavalry, Gatling guns, against the Zulu army and crushed it decisively. The Zulu kingdom was annexed. Cetshwayo was captured and exiled. The army that Shaka had built was disbanded. The nation he had forged was divided into 13 separate territories, each ruled by compliant chiefs loyal to the British. The age of Zulu military dominance was over. But Shaka's influence did not end with the fall of the Zulu kingdom. The Mfecane, the scattering of peoples that his military expansion had triggered, reshaped the demographic and political map of southern Africa for generations. The kingdoms that emerged from the chaos of the Mfecane, the Matabele in Zimbabwe, the Swazi in Swaziland, the various Sotho and Shangaan states, all bore the mark of Shaka's innovations. They adopted variants of his military system, his tactics, his centralized governance structures. They built armies modeled on the Zulu regiments. They fought using the close combat techniques he had perfected. In this sense, Shaka did not just build a kingdom. He created a template that spread across half a continent. He demonstrated that African societies could organize themselves into powerful centralized states capable of projecting military force over vast distances. He proved that African military tactics could rival, and in some cases surpass, those of external powers. And he showed that leadership, strategy, and innovation could overcome the disadvantages of limited resources and technology. These lessons were not lost on future generations of African leaders, both in the colonial period and in the struggles for independence that followed. The comparison between Shaka Zulu and Napoleon Bonaparte is not arbitrary. It has been made by historians for over a century, and for good reason. Both men rose from relatively humble origins to become military geniuses who reshaped their regions through conquest. Both revolutionized warfare in their respective contexts. Both built empires through a combination of strategic brilliance, ruthless discipline, and personal charisma. Napoleon transformed European warfare by perfecting the use of mobile artillery, rapid troop movements, and the corps system. Shaka transformed Southern African warfare by inventing the Iklwa, perfecting close combat tactics, and creating a standing professional army. Napoleon conquered most of Europe before his ambitions outran his resources, and he was defeated by coalitions of enemies. Shaka conquered most of southeastern Africa before his kingdom ran into the limits of its economic model, and he was assassinated by his own family. Both men were brilliant administrators who created legal and governmental systems that outlasted them. Both were ruthless leaders who inspired fanatical loyalty in their soldiers while terrifying their subjects. Both died in exile, Napoleon on St. Helena, Shaka in an unmarked grave, having seen their empires begin to crumble. But there are also important differences. Napoleon operated in a world of established nation-states, written laws, and centuries of military theory. Shaka operated in a world of oral tradition, clan-based societies, and warfare that was as much ritual as strategy. Napoleon had access to gunpowder weapons, modern logistics, and a literate officer corps. Shaka worked with Iron Age technology, cattle-based economics, and oral command structures. That Shaka achieved what he did with the resources available to him makes his accomplishments in some ways even more remarkable than Napoleon's. Over the decades and centuries since his death, Shaka has become as much myth as man. Different groups have claimed him for different purposes, shaped his story to serve different agendas. To some, he is a symbol of African resistance against colonialism, a leader who proved that African peoples could build powerful states and field formidable armies. To others, he is a cautionary tale about the dangers of militarism and authoritarianism, a tyrant whose quest for power brought suffering to millions. To the Zulu people themselves, Shaka occupies a complex position. He is honored as the founder of the nation, the man who took scattered clans and forged them into a unified kingdom. But he is also remembered as a harsh ruler whose later years were marked by cruelty and madness. The truth, as always, is more complicated than any single narrative. Shaka was a product of his time and place, a world of constant warfare, fluid borders, and survival of the fittest politics. He was brilliant, innovative, and visionary. He was also brutal, paranoid, and ultimately self-destructive. He built a kingdom that lasted barely a decade under his rule but influenced a region for centuries. He created a military system that was studied by European officers and emulated by African leaders. He became a legend whose name is still spoken with reverence and fear. It is important to acknowledge that much of what we know about Shaka comes from European sources, traders, missionaries, colonial officials, who viewed him through the lens of their own prejudices and imperial ambitions. These accounts often exaggerated his cruelty while downplaying his strategic genius. They portrayed him as a savage tyrant rather than a sophisticated political leader. This colonial narrative served a purpose. It justified European conquest by painting African rulers as barbaric despots whose subjects needed to be saved through colonization. It allowed Europeans to see themselves as bringing civilization to a continent of chaos, rather than as invaders destroying functioning societies for their own profit. Modern scholarship has worked to correct these distortions, using oral histories, archaeological evidence, and comparative analysis to paint a more balanced picture of Shaka and his kingdom. We now understand that the Zulu state was not a simple military dictatorship, but a complex political entity with systems of governance, law, and social organization that were sophisticated by any standard. We also understand that the violence attributed to Shaka, while real, was not exceptional for his time and place. The early 19th century was a period of upheaval across southern Africa, driven by drought, population pressure, and the expanding slave trade. Shaka's militarism was both a cause and a consequence of this broader instability. This does not excuse the atrocities committed under his rule, but it does place them in context, allowing us to see Shaka as a human being shaped by his circumstances rather than as a one-dimensional monster or hero. Today, Shaka Zulu remains a powerful symbol in South Africa and beyond. His image appears on currency, monuments, and public buildings. His name is invoked in political speeches, cultural celebrations, and academic debates. He is claimed by Zulu nationalists as a symbol of ethnic pride, by Pan-Africanists as an icon of African achievement, and by South Africans of all backgrounds as a part of their shared history. But Shaka's legacy is also contested. Some see the celebration of a militaristic ruler as problematic in a democracy trying to move beyond its violent past. Others argue that focusing on Shaka's brutality while ignoring his achievements plays into colonial narratives that diminished African accomplishments. These debates reflect deeper questions about how societies remember their past, which histories they choose to celebrate, and which they choose to critique. They remind us that historical figures like Shaka are not just subjects of academic study, but living symbols whose meanings change with each generation. Despite centuries of study, many questions about Shaka remain unanswered. We do not know exactly when he was born. We do not know where he is buried. We do not have his own words, his own account of his life and motivations. Everything we know comes from secondhand sources, some reliable, some dubious, all filtered through the biases of their authors. We do not know what Shaka truly thought about the Europeans, whether he saw them as potential allies or inevitable enemies. We do not know whether he had a plan for the long-term sustainability of the Zulu state, or whether he was simply riding a tiger he could not dismount. We do not know if his descent into paranoia and violence after his mother's death was a fundamental character flaw or a tragic response to unbearable grief. These gaps in our knowledge are frustrating, but they are also, in a way, appropriate, because Shaka, for all his historical importance, remains fundamentally unknowable, a figure whose inner life we can only guess at, whose true motivations we can only infer. He is, in the end, what all great historical figures eventually become, a mirror in which each generation sees its own concerns, its own questions, its own struggles reflected back. So who was Shaka Zulu? What is his place in the grand sweep of human history? He was a military innovator who changed the way wars were fought in southern Africa. He was a state builder who forged a nation from scattered clans. He was a brilliant strategist who understood that power comes not just from force, but from organization, discipline, and psychological dominance. He was also a man shaped by trauma, the illegitimate son who never forgot the humiliation of his childhood, who built an empire in part to prove his worth to a world that had rejected him, a man who demanded absolute loyalty because he had learned that betrayal was the natural state of things, a man who could not tolerate weakness because he had spent his youth being seen as weak. In the span of barely 12 years, from 1816 to 1828, Shaka transformed a minor clan into a regional superpower. He created a military system that would influence African warfare for generations. He set in motion demographic and political changes that reshaped southern Africa for centuries. And then he was murdered by the people closest to him, brought down not by external enemies, but by the internal contradictions of the system he had built. His story is a reminder that even the greatest leaders are mortal, that even the mightiest empires are fragile, and that power built on fear and violence is inherently unstable. But it is also a reminder that individuals can change the course of history, that strategic genius can overcome material disadvantages, and that leadership, for good or ill, matters profoundly. In the final analysis, Shaka Zulu poses a question that every society must answer for itself. What do we owe to those who achieve greatness through methods we find morally troubling? How do we honor accomplishment while acknowledging atrocity? How do we tell the truth about the past without reducing complex human beings to simplistic heroes or villains? There are no easy answers to these questions. Shaka was neither saint nor monster, but something more complicated. A human being who achieved extraordinary things through extraordinary means, whose legacy includes both remarkable accomplishments and terrible suffering. He lived in a world where survival often depended on one's willingness to be ruthless, where mercy was seen as weakness, and where the only security came from strength. He mastered that world more completely than perhaps any African leader of his era. And in doing so, he left a mark on history that no amount of time can erase. Empires rise and fall. Kings are born and die. Armies march and are forgotten. But every so often, a figure emerges who changes not just the political landscape, but the very way we think about what is possible. Shaka Zulu was one of those figures. He took a minor clan and built a kingdom. He took traditional warfare and revolutionized it. He took scattered peoples and forged them into a nation. He rose from exile to become one of the most powerful rulers in Africa. And he did it all with little more than discipline, strategy, and a spear. His reign lasted barely more than a decade. His kingdom would fall within a generation of his death. But his influence would ripple across southern Africa for centuries, shaping societies, inspiring leaders, and forcing the world to recognize that African civilizations could produce military geniuses, sophisticated states, and transformative leaders. Today, nearly 200 years after his death, Shaka Zulu remains a subject of fascination, debate, and study. His story is taught in schools, analyzed by historians, and invoked in political discourse. He is remembered, argued over, and reinterpreted by each new generation. Because Shaka's story is not just about one man or one kingdom, it is about what human beings are capable of, both the heights of achievement and the depths of cruelty. It is about how societies organize themselves in times of crisis. It is about the relationship between individual genius and historical forces. It is about power, its uses, and its limits. And it is a reminder that history is not just made by nations or movements or impersonal forces. It is made by people, complex, flawed, brilliant, tragic people who make choices that echo down through the centuries. Shaka Zulu made his choices. He built his empire. He left his mark. And now you know his story. If you've made it this far into Shaka's story, his reign, and his fall, you're part of the few who remember the forgotten kings of our world. These are the stories that shaped continents, that built nations, that changed the course of human history. But they're often overlooked, overshadowed by more familiar narratives. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Because every great civilization, every remarkable leader, every turning point in history deserves to be remembered. Not as myth, not as propaganda, but as truth. Complicated, fascinating, and profoundly human. Thank you for watching.